Hey guys, welcome back to another What If. Today we are doing part 22 What If Korean chakra turns Naruto into a female. If you don't know what else part, that'll be linked in the description down below or at the end of this What If. That will take you to a place where you can watch all the parts in order from 1 to 20. This one. And yeah guys, with that out of the way, let's get into this. 2 weeks, 6 months and 2 years would go by as there'd be a girl seemingly just sitting on the edge, as it'd somewhat be somewhat night or early night, as she'd seem to have long beautiful red hair, 3 wrist marks on each cheek, and violet slitted pupils, beautiful creamy white skin, though that was somewhat hard to make out, though adorned upon the head, just like what everyone else or everything else had, where she currently was adorned was 2 foxes, though somewhat unlike her long beautiful hair, they were violet, though both were on the tips of her ears they were tipped purple, and somewhat behind her would lay her 7 beautiful violet tails, all dipped at the tips, all dipped purple as well. And though her legs would seem to be hanging off over the edge of a somewhat hill or mountain-ish, as she then feels seemingly 2 lumps press against her back, as you'd hear a voice. Well then, are you somewhat ready for tomorrow? Yeah, I'm somewhat excited to see them after 2.5 years. Do you think they'll be recognize me? Do you think they'll? Well, it depends. If you obviously go showing off your ears and tails now, then maybe not, but they'll more than likely recognise you. After all, you really haven't changed all that much, besides from wide hips. Breasts, of course, have grown, and well, yeah, you're obviously taller from your original height of 5'2", 5'5", 5'6", which I would simply just nod as the person would then stop somewhat hugging her, and would then somewhat sit down beside her and go. And this person was the person who had just sat beside her, was none other. Well, would somewhat have, unlike her daughter, would have somewhat the same or a similar colour red hair, though adorned upon her head, instead of 2 violet foxes, would be 2 red foxes, though the tips were tipped a fiery orange. And another difference from her and her daughter was her tails. Unlike her daughter, she had 9 red tails, though all dipped a fiery orange. She was none other than Kurama, the 9-tailed fox, whereas Konoha knows her as the 9 tails demon fox. And yeah, and her daughter, or who she somewhat considered a daughter, was none other than one Naruto Uzumaki, a person born male on the night that she was released. Though, due to some unique stances with the seal that she was sealed within and her own chakra, she turned this once 12-year-old boy into a woman, and thus for the past 3 years now he had been a she. And yeah, though don't seem no go well. So good. Well then, I guess we should head to bed. After all, I've got a feeling it's going to be one heck of a long day tomorrow. I would simply just nod. I should get up after a couple of minutes and they'd simply go to bed. Next morning there'd be a load of some baby foxes and baby kitsune to adults, or like wishing her some good luck on her journey, on her journey back, and telling her that she could summon them anytime she wishes. She'd nod and she'd thank them for being just so nice to her and letting her stay for 2.5 years, and of course allowing to train amongst them and within their fighting styles and that. Though they would simply wave that off, and she'd then say bye, as she'd simply hold up a single hand sign and she'd disappear in a puff of smoke. Though 2 to 5 minutes out away from Konoha's main gates, there'd be a puff of smoke just beside the road, though slightly within a forested area. Be a similar puff of would be another puff of smoke. Though that would slowly open her eyes as she'd look around, and she'd smile as she'd lean outwards from the slightly forested area, as she'd then see Konoha. She'd smile, though she'd then seemingly close eyes once more as her ears and tails would seemingly disappear from her body entirely, as she'd she'd seemingly pull them within herself, which is it's the main way kitsunes hide their ears and tail. It's slightly uncomfortable, though once you've done it for long enough, you get used to it. She then seemingly walk out from the shade of the slightly forested area. She'd then walk on the path. And minutes later she'd be walking through the gates as the two seemingly eternal gate guards, as they are known, would seemingly look upon the person I'd entered and go, "Hey, doesn't she look familiar?" "Yeah, it's..." As they'd seemingly look at one another and would smile. "So, she's back," they'd seemingly say in unison. I should walk forward, continue to, though men would look upon her and would would send her looks of lust, and women would send looks of jealousy. She seemingly had a body to them that was godlike, absolutely beautiful and seemingly flawless. Her whisker marks just add into her beauty, seemingly. And yeah, So I should walk into kind of her, she'd somewhat look up to where she was going and smile as in front of her was a mountain with 5 faces on it. As she'd smile as she thinks so they've finally gotten around to adding Barchan's face onto it. She'd seemingly think to herself. A couple seconds later she'd start thinking, though another thought would pop into her head, which would be that, well, she could remember when she'd truly somewhat for the somewhat first time ever truly had somewhat become a woman completely, not just like a somewhat A to somewhat B cup breast. She truly had become a somewhat woman with a vagina, and that she'd sworn to almost anyone that would listen to her that she would never ever somewhat let anything that could get her pregnant into her. Though now she'd somewhat similarly, that was like chakra that thought as now, well, of course she'd think somewhat similarly, a bit differently, and well, she may only still be somewhat 15 years old, though soon to be in a couple of months 16. She had somewhat, though in a somewhat time there for at least the last somewhat, say 8 or so months, had somewhat started thinking about one day maybe not quite settling down, but definitely somewhat starting a family of her own, having children and that, which was a similar interesting thought as she could remember herself even up until somewhat a year ago denying the fact that she wouldn't allow anyone to get her damn pregnant. And yet now, at least, maybe when she turned 18 or 20 years old, maybe then she'd somewhat let herself get pregnant. She'd think to herself and start a family, though she would most definitely not settle down with anyone. No, she was a Cenobia, not she, and a proud one at that, and she'd beat up anyone that would think that she'd just be somewhat their housewife. They could go and F themselves. She'd just simply think to herself as, minutes later, a person simply somewhat in an office, there'd be a knock on the door as a person would simply look up, would simply blink a couple times before saying enter. This person was none other than the Hokage Konoha's 5th. As she would somewhat look forward as the person would enter and go, "Hey Barchan, long time no see." The person Tsunade Senju would Konoha's 5th would seemingly get up, though somewhat I would slightly twitch from the remark. She'd go, "Well, hey there brat, how are you doing? And I somewhat hope your training was fruitful." She'd similarly nod and go, "Yeah," though I somewhat she'd somewhat start scratching her cheeks as she'd go, "Well, I'd somewhat need a new hit hiatus." So I'd go, "Oh, why so? What happened to your old one?" "Well, me and wow." She'd similarly somewhat stop at that as I'd similarly get the point of it, send her arm boot out. The arm boot that were hidden in the shadows. 4 of them somewhat would, as she'd then similarly go through a couple of hand signs before a barrier would similarly erupt around them, as she'd somewhat nod and gesture to continue, as she'd go, "Well, me and somewhat, as you know, the somewhat Nine Tails were, well, because I'd gone back to my my summoning contract's homeland to train within my kitsune form, or now just what I am full-time Silent Quackneye, as Naruto's letter is until ears and tails were out, as Naruto would soon go, so you can't, no, I can no longer generate human chakra. So Naruto just knock down and go, wow, this is story. So none go, well, me and Kurama, me and the Narutos were training just one day, and well, yeah, we ended up shattering it. And though we'd picked up the pieces and had managed to get them roughly, well, we'd glued them back together, though we'd I'd decided to have it framed as, and yeah, so now I would simply just not and go, well, I should go down into a drawer, and we'd simply go, well, I'd presume you'd want red, white, as you just yeah. So I'd then grab a red head height, and we'd then close the drawer, and somewhat unknown to Naruto, it was actually somewhat not exactly common, though it was pretty uncommon for most shinobi to come in and actually request a new head height, mainly because of either lost or in a somewhat similar-ish case, broken, shattered, or unable to identify, like the identification that generally situated in the middle is somewhat been, like it's been ruined to the point where the identification is somewhat hard to be proven, thus a request for a new one is generally granted. Most of the time, most shinobi are, or at least most shinobi that generally require a new one are generally shinobi that go on S, say dangerously high A ranks to S rank mission, so very rare do shinobis ever really require a new one. Yeah. And yeah, though time would simply go by, as there'd then be a person bastard and go, Hagare-sama, should turn ahead and go, what is it? And both would, though Naruto and the messenger would say in unison, it sooner. Snyder would suddenly crack an eyebrow, and the person would suddenly turn to Naruto and kind of, how did you know that? Then she'd then say message and go, right. After giving it, she'd then tell the person that was dismissed. The person would quickly get out, somewhat being afraid, and Naruto would then say Gara. Naruto would send a somewhat questioning look, as Naruto would suddenly seem to look to get ready to leave, so she'd quickly open it and would read, be somewhat suddenly surprised, as she'd then shout out for Anbu to go fetch. She'd go, Anbu, fetch Hatake Kakashi and Sakura Haruno immediately. Hi. Seconds later, Anbu would somewhat be back with one Hatake Kakashi and Haruno Sakura. After somewhat soon, though Naruto similarly wouldn't even suddenly seemed to notice their arrival, and Kakashi Hatake had similarly done the same thing, as this was to somewhat be called in immediately generally meant A to S rank importance. And while, whatever this mission was, he could, somewhat get to really know who, someone Naruto was. Those I could go Naruto. So that was all that should get as Snyder somewhat clearer, somewhat clearer focus, as Sakura to me somewhat look at her a bit sheepishly. Naruto just somewhat ignore that as Snyder then tell the two that they would be somewhat going with Naruto to Suna to go and rescue the Kazekage. Kakashi and Sakura would similarly be surprised, and Kakashi would go and who will be rescuing him from, I should say, the Akatsuki. Don't be, though, they just nod and they would confirm Naruto's somewhat thought that Gaara was the Kazekage. Yeah. And she would then somewhat tell them that they were dismissed and to leave as soon as possible. Kakashi would somewhat ask seemingly not even bother asking Naruto, as she looked like she was about to bolt at any second. Though he was somewhat always seemingly somewhat ready to go. So he would simply just ask Sakura if she was ready. She would nod, and Kakashi would then somewhat tell them to somewhat meet him at the gate. To meet him at the gates, and they'd all sunshine over. They then proceeded to somewhat leave with the two Eternal Gate guards, similarly with one of the Eternal Gate guards simply stating that she's somewhat she just got back and she's already out on another mission. She's already out on a mission. Which then go, yeah, seems so, though it must be important for them to send, all three of them out, which the other one simply just nod and go, yeah, wonder what it could be. And as they would similarly head towards Suna, Kakashi, Naruto, Sakura, and Kakashi, Sasuke, Sakura, and Naruto would somewhat get to just somewhat catch up with one another, and that though Naruto would state that would similarly channel a bit of a chakra, which would give her skin a very small violet hue, which Kakashi would similarly nod and somewhat understand that she was in a way no longer human, because somewhat around a week to a couple of days before she'd left, someone had revealed to Kakashi that she could somewhat transform into a kitsune and then into a somewhat tailed beast form, and that she could generate tailed beast chakra, or what she called her kitsune chakra. And those Sakura similarly seemed none of the wiser. After a while of running, Sakura would similarly start be somewhat lightly panting, as Sakura would similarly somewhat point out, hey look, isn't that Tamari? Because she'd someone look down and go, it is. We should somewhat stop and tell her. She'd be able to somewhat help us get to Suna somewhat faster, as she knows the desert the best. They all three would somewhat drop down, and Tamari would somewhat be a bit surprised and go, Kakashi, Sakura, and she'd be surprised at Naruto. Naruto go, hey Tamari, though as tomorrow somewhat look at and go, what's wrong is, what's wrong is Kakashi, somewhat look at and go, it's Gara. Someone go, what about him? He's been captured. Naruto state, and tomorrow simply go wide-eyed as Naruto then somewhat tell them to somewhat stay close around Kakashi. Though before Kakashi could say anything, Naruto had already bitten a thumb and was already somewhat midway and slammed her palm into the ground. Though once her palm hit the ground, she'd somewhat yell out just as the palm would hit the ground, summoning Jutsu. A giant puff of smoke and a similarly giant six-tailed fox would appear out of the smoke as Fox would say, Naruto-chan, how may I be of service? Can you get us to sooner stat? Hi. As you then suddenly start running toward the giant six-tailed fox would start running towards Suna as she'd somewhat slide down as they'd then somewhat talk, though Kakashi'd somewhat start off as though, so Naruto, I'm surprised you're able to do the something jutsu just without even doing any hand signs. She'd somewhat nod and would go, yeah, though it was a pain to somewhat learn how to do it without doing any hand signs. Seriously, it's like you have to learn the somewhat inside to learn the inside and the inside and out of the damned somewhat the damn cell matrix and how it worked and how it and how it could somewhat just from a single piece of your blood locate the somewhat similarly summoned animal that you have a contract with and then summon the one that you have, or at least Kakashi would similarly just nod at that as somewhat he himself had found a way around it, though less he and more somewhat Kushina, who had somewhat had made a couple of scrolls for him, which are all completely reusable, which was a similar deal where he just simply had to bite his thumb and somewhat drag his bleeding thumb across the scroll and then somewhat wrap it back up and somewhat send chakra into it and slam it on the ground, which would do the exact same thing. It just somewhat required a lot less time than going through the hand signs required for the summoning jutsu. So within a battle, somewhat seconds to even milliseconds to microseconds counted. And there was so many time would somewhat go by, and just as it would reach nightfall, tomorrow somewhat the fox would simply state that Suna was somewhat up ahead and that he'd be stopping soon, so that he doesn't send somewhat soon into a high alert. They'd nod as they'd get ready to somewhat land or get off, and seemingly the fox would seemingly just jump as it would then somewhat dispel, simply stating that this was as far as he could go. Naruto would just somewhat thank him as he'd dispel, and they'd all then somewhat start plummeting, though being all shinobi they'd somewhat be able to land quite efficiently and then start running off towards Suna. And, it'd be another similarly 15, 20, 25 minutes, though they'd somewhat arrive, and the somewhat gate guards would ask if there's a medic among them. Sakura say hi, I'm a medic Nin. They would somewhat then somewhat nod and would tell her to somewhat follow them. Tomorrow somewhat would ask what was going on, as they'd state the somewhat attacks he had come in and managed to somewhat breach. I'd managed to somewhat come in and somewhat capture Gara, Kankro, your brother, had gone after somewhat them, and just like a team had just come back from trying to locate Kankro, and they'd managed to locate him, though he was not in a good way and definitely poisoned. Tomorrow would somewhat pale at that, as they'd be running through the village towards Sangakure's hospital. And yeah, they'd soon as hospital, they'd arrive there and they then somewhat a second or so, a couple of seconds later, they would then somewhat arrive outside of the place in which Kankro was held in. They would somewhat enter, and Kankro was similarly in a bad state. How enough he was conscious, he'd somewhat look over and would similarly go, would somewhat be able to barely somewhat say Kakashi, like he would just barely be able to say K.A., though Kakashi would realise that he wanted him, so he'd somewhat step forward a bit close, as he would then open up his hand as he'd go, "That's all I managed to," as he went in a lot of pain, get. Kakashi would just nod and go, simply somewhat thank him, as Kakashi would somewhat look down and would see it was simply cloth. That was good. He had dogs they could track, and due to the fact that it was a desert, they didn't often rain much, so they could at least wait until somewhat Sakura was finished and had somebody fan or made a somewhat anti-poison to the poison that was currently in him, and they could then somewhat head out then, and it'd simply be at least a day or two later when Sakura would somewhat come back from where she was and somewhat started operating on Kankro once more, getting rid of all the poison that she could out of him before then injecting him with the anti-poison. She'd say that she'd then somewhat walk out, would tell them that he should now be, would somewhat walk up to Tamara and say that Kankro would be just fine, though he needs a little bed rest. I'd just somewhat nod in sign of relief and would thank Sakura. Sakura just somewhat rather far off as she'd then walk towards some of her team, as she'd state that she somewhat only has maybe two, at least two or maybe three somewhat doses left, or at least all that she managed to make. They would nod and and a person would then seemingly somewhat though come on, seemingly somewhat go, "It's the right thing," and would then seemingly try and attack Kakashi. Kakashi would somewhat be a bit surprised that someone had been, had known the right thing, and though before even somewhat Kakashi could even somewhat seemingly catch or dodge whoever was attacking him, and then somewhat mistaking him for his father, and after somewhat step in front and and then someone already had caught the punch hadn't fork there, someone sensei should go, don't know who this white fang is, but that isn't him, that's my sensei, Kakashi, Hatake Kakashi. Old hag. Should similarly somewhat glare at Naruto, though there'd be another person and go, it's true. Though he may look similar, he's no white fang. Should somewhat similarly turn her head to glance. Should similarly somewhat lean her body somewhat slightly sideways to see around Naruto, and should go, aha, it seems so. I was just as though Naruto would seemingly just somewhat glare at her more and would somewhat let her go. And go, don't try and do that again, old hag. And yeah, a similar somewhat argument-ish would seemingly go about like Tamari and Anton, or someone who was somewhat trying to, go over to rescue Gaara. Though Naruto somewhat I'd of course managed to somewhat see what Kankura had somewhat not had somewhat dropped, and of course somewhat now being Kitsu full time, her somewhat sense of smell had obviously increased to that of seemingly dogs and cats and that, so she, and obviously Kurama had also had taught her how to somewhat track by sense, because it was a useful skill, and even more useful if your sense of smell is good enough to the point where you can smell even poison. So yeah, so she'd obviously doing that exchange had somewhat took the cloth and had somewhat sniffed it a bit before suddenly giving it back to Kakashi without him realising, and she'd somewhat had done replacement and shadow clone, making the replacement and shadow clone seamlessly. And without a puff smoker, she'd somewhat replaced herself outside of the hospital. She'd then somewhat somewhat surpassing her chakra to the point where no one else could sense her. She'd then somewhat start jumping from rooftop to rooftop quickly before she'd land outside, and then somewhat start darting forward, being able to somewhat sniff where the similarly scent trail led. I was just going to go, Kit, you sure you can take them on by yourself? I should go, well, yeah, so if I wait for them any longer, somewhat, well, they could, well, come in somewhat just nod and go, well, I can't exactly tell you how far away they are, though they haven't at least yet, in a way, haven't got to that base yet, as my brother is still very much within Gaara at the moment. Just nod, and yeah, after getting far enough away, should from Suna, should let her ears and tail somewhat out, should start channeling somewhat her chakra into her muscles, pushing her speed even higher from somewhat just borderline from somewhat just high S rank to just beyond S rank, double, maybe even triple, as you'd easily somewhat break the sound barrier. As you'd then just launch forward and would simply cross, just easily, somewhat seemingly it was just desert after somewhat just sea of sand. And yeah, though before she knew it, she could somewhat somewhat smelled that the obviously centre had been getting somewhat stronger and stronger. And yeah, and somewhat obviously 5 or so, well yeah, say 2 to 3 seconds ago, Kurama had stated that he could now somewhat sense them, and that they were, say, somewhat at the current speed, somewhat say 10 seconds away. Yeah. And somewhat a second, or, well yeah, though somewhat 2 seconds away, the two Akatsuki would suddenly somewhat stop and go someone's, no, that's all the one person simply got to say was someone as somewhat their head would be sliced off cleanly and his blood would spray everywhere. The other person would simply be shocked at the sheer somewhat speed at the person arriving. And yes, you then somewhat turn around and go, you won't go anywhere with him. Person would somewhat narrow his eyes and go, huh, the Cubits in Cherokee. They would simply somewhat look over, and that was indeed the real Deidara. She just killed us. He'd go, well, somewhat just think to himself, this just got a lot harder. And somewhat, though, though those somewhat start fighting, those should easily be able to avoid somewhat the poison which you can easily smell. And yeah, she'd somewhat just manage to just straight up smash the somewhat tail away, making it completely useless. And when she'd somewhat suddenly smashed the body, another person somewhat came out. Though she'd narrow her eyes and she could somewhat sense at the she could somewhat sense, not as great as Kurama, but she could sense obviously all the chakra and that was coming from one place. And she then seemingly somewhat start, she then grab a kunai and would then somewhat lace it with wind chakra to quite, simply just send wind chakra into it and somewhat filling the kunai as far as she possibly could. Quite frankly, the kunai would once again shatter the sound, shatter the sound barrier and would suddenly go straight through the seemingly cylindrical object. And yeah, and she would then somewhat look over and would go over. She'd then put her hand onto Gaara's neck and would somewhat close her eyes, and she'd sigh, his pulse is there, though it's weak. And Kurama would state that his chakra was also somewhat low, and that she should somewhat get them back before seemingly the Akatsuki realise that they're not there. That would just somewhat nod as she then somewhat turn around and would then somewhat send chakra throughout her body, transforming herself into a tailed beast form. I should then somewhat have one of her somewhat 7 tails wrap around Gaara and somewhat lift them onto her back, and she then she just have one of her somewhat tails just wrap around Gaara's body. She then somewhat start the somewhat now maybe hour-long journey back to Suna. Hour and a half, as she didn't want to exactly run too fast just in case somewhat it may, like any underlying somewhat injury or internal bleeding, may get worse. There was no medicing. yeah, similarly an hour later, and should somewhat release her would somewhat pull her chakra back in somewhat into herself, reverting herself back into her somewhat assumed state, as should somewhat as should similarly somewhat, I know, I should continue to dash forward towards sooner. I should be somewhat around 10 or so minutes away, and she knew within a couple of seconds that they would be able to spot her, and that within another somewhat 5 to 10, 15, 20 seconds after that, they would notice her ears and tail, which wouldn't exactly be good. So she'd somewhat bring the tail that was, or now tails that were wrapped around Gara, somewhat forward. She'd somewhat hold her somewhat hands out in front as her tails would somewhat unwrap around Gara, as in somewhat fall a tiny bit and land into her arms, as she then somewhat pull her ears and tails back within herself. As the similarly to somewhat gate guards would look forward as they go, huh? Isn't that, somewhat the girl that came with Kakashi and the pink-haired medic. The other, and she seems to be carrying someone, they'd state, and a minute, a couple of seconds later, they'd realise that it was very much Gara. They'd be surprised, and they'd somewhat call medic names. I was like Nambu and somewhat going and somewhat request obviously medic names to the front gate. And obviously Kakashi could somewhat feel, as he then somewhat realise, as he would look over, and the somewhat clone of Naruto that she'd somewhat kept that, and so like within probably a couple of seconds to a minute or so was about to leave, and the clone would just somewhat giving him a smile before dispelling, as Kakashi would just be surprised, as he would just think she went up against two, somewhat the Akatsuki by herself. What was she thinking? He'd somewhat think is, obviously, somewhat right, and Sakura would be the maintenance would somewhat arrive, and Sakura would simply stare at her, confused at Naruto, and go, Naruto, you just, as Naruto would somewhat go, well, that's somewhat, left the clone, a shadow clone, somewhat with you, so I replaced myself with a shadow clone. Damn it, you were taking too long, and, well, the longer you took, the more likely Gara was to more likely they were to start pulling the one tails out of Gara. So I laughed and got it myself. And so Kakashi would somewhat just go, that was reckless. She'd shrug and go, well, there was only two of them. Kakashi would blink, two, yep, and I can tell that they're both dead. Kakashi would somewhat be surprised that Naruto had managed to kill two people, though Naruto would say that she took one completely by surprise, as completely by surprise, and had cleanly cut his head off. And someone would and she'd somewhat pull out somewhat scroll, and would go here. They've somewhat got the bodies of the two people I killed, though one seems to be my puppet of sorts. They would somewhat look at a big fuse and should somewhat shrug. I don't know. It's just what he seemed to be when I somewhat put his body on top. He simply just nodded and showed somewhat when one of the people would somewhat until it, everyone simply gasp, somewhat Daedra and what's the story of the red sands, as they'd all someone look at hers, and yeah, it was clear that Naruto was definitely, or at least somewhat, Naruto was definitely, the training that she'd gone on, the 2.5 years, was definitely fruitful, and that she was now definitely a nice rank shinobi. And that's where I'm going to end it, guys. So if you have enjoyed this part of the if you have enjoyed this part, tell me in the comments down below. And yeah, guys, hope you guys have a good day or night, wherever you are and whenever you watch this, and good bye.